So I'm Tiffany, and I'm really excited to be here, and thank you guys for having me. I'm pretty nervous, excited to be coming after these pretty awesome speakers. But I'm just gonna get started. So I'm here today to talk to you about true stories. And I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about what I mean by that. And basically, I think we're facing a kind of an epidemic. And that epidemic might be called something like bullshit. We sort of bullshit each other, we bullshit our colleagues, our bosses bullshit their bosses, and it's kind of just this beautiful, endless cycle of bullshit. I sort of like how Hunter S. Thompson puts it. I have a theory that the truth is never told between the 9 to 5 business hours. Now, I want to be clear here that I'm not talking about lying. Most every single person I know is a very lovely, honest kind of a person. What I mean is something a little different than that, and it's kind of that we kind of fail to get to the bottom of what it is we're trying to say, to sort of say what we mean. And I'm not judging. I'm actually pretty bad at that myself, and there's no guarantees that I'm going to get to that in this talk. And also, any sociologist will tell you that this kind of bullshit is just sort of a natural part of sort of adult human existence. And as I said, it's also a big part of my life. So as I said earlier, as Andy said, I'm a content strategist, and probably a lot of you actually don't know what that means, because the name itself sounds a little like bullshit. In fact, whenever I hear the word content, all I see in my mind's eye is this like giant jar of mayonnaise. And I sort of imagine my job is sort of make this mayonnaise from scratch and then like give it to designers, and they put it on sandwiches, and then they give it to marketers, and then those marketers distribute the sandwiches all around the internet. It's terrible. It's a terrible visual for our work. But if you ask somebody else what I would do, or what I do, they probably would say something like, oh, yeah, she's that like editor, writer, therapist, designer, cat lady one. She's in the corner with the like 200 Word docs on her desk. And this would all be right. But often what my job boils down to is something closer to a bullshit watch. Really just the early prevention, maintenance, and emergency cleanup of bullshit. I make sure we don't say things like synergies and boil the ocean and I have an ask. Now, I don't want to dig on this editorial function that I play, because I actually think it's really important, and I think it does a lot of good things for organizations. I think it doesn't come naturally all the time for us not to say boil the ocean, believe it or not. But at the same time, Bullshit Watch isn't really the only thing that I want to be doing. It's not the thing that I get most excited about. It's not the thing that always brings the most sparkles. One of the things that I get really excited about is when I get a chance to sort of take a break from Bullshit Watch, when I can sort of sit down with like designers and engineers and CEOs or kids or cats or whatever it is, and kind of like talk about what it is we're trying to say, and then sort of come up with creative ways that we might say that. But of course, this is really hard, and as I said, this doesn't really come naturally. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and most of us aren't very good at it. And a lot of writers talk about this all the time, including this guy, David, I don't know how to say his name, Barthelme or Barthelme, depends on who you ask, but the truth is a hard apple, whether one is catching or throwing it. Trying to get to the bottom of what it is we're trying to say, trying to get to the truth, is kind of like this. You're this little guy just sort of running along, and it's this flat plane, and you have this walking stick, but you don't even need it because you're awesome. And then suddenly you just like smack into this really steep incline. This is often in the middle of a creative process. You get to that incline, but you're brave and you're plucky, and you go, you know what, I'm gonna go for it, I'm gonna do it. And you start just basically like sprinting up the hill. And by the first exit, you're like, I'm like running out of Cliff Bars. And by the second exit, you're completely out of water. And by the third exit, you're almost dead. So you just like leave. You just totally give it up. Reaching the summit of truth, whatever that might mean for you, is not for the faint of heart. But I want to help you reach it. And it's kind of selfish because I'd like to reach it myself. So I want to kind of talk about that today, but first I should say I'm really no expert in this. I hear that you're supposed to log like 10,000 hours to become a master at anything, and so far I've really only logged like 4,000 hours of telling the truth. I have, though, spent a lot of time on Bullshit Watch, and I did take a bunch of philosophy classes, and I do some dabbling in creative writing, so I'm going to give it a shot. And in case you just want to bail right now, I'm just going to tell you what I'm going to tell you up front. Number one, to reach a summit of truth, remember that you're telling stories. Number two, when you're doing that, try to sort of tell your story. Number three, take a journey inward. And number four, when all hell breaks loose, remember to call on your muses. So, number one. So this is something we've kind of been talking about all throughout the day, and something that I've started to sort of come to a realization of lately too, which is that basically everything we do in our work kind of tells a story. So for me, that might include anything from like the lowliest little error message to the biggest product launch to something I'm saying to you right now. It's all a kind of a story. And if you don't like to think of those kind of vague terms, you could just think of it as like, okay, part of a brand. Like everything you make leads to some sort of brand narrative for the people you make it for, however you want to think of it. But the fact of the matter is those stories happen, and they happen whether we mean for them to or not, because we're kind of just storytelling creatures. That's like what we do when we communicate. We'll make a story almost out of just anything. The psychologists are always really good about talking about this, so I'm just going to read you a pretty long quote. Stories are how we think. They are how we make meaning of life. Call them schemas, scripts, cognitive maps, mental models, metaphors, or narratives. Stories are how we understand our place in the world and create our identities. So that's like a brainful. But what I think it boils down to is the fact that stories are these little shortcuts for us. They're these ways that we get around without having to look at every single piece of data in front of us and make it into something from scratch. Another way of putting it might be to say that we sort of get by on a diet of canned meaning. But of course, there's some dangers associated with living on a diet of canned anything, including canned meaning. So I thought I would tell you a couple stories that might illustrate the dangers of our own shortcuts in our stories. So this is a story about me. I want, for those of you who know me, pretend that you've never met me before. This is Tiffany number one, and I'm just going to go for it. Hi, my name is Tiffany. I'm a content strategist at Pinterest. I'm the only one there, and I'm responsible for being the voice of their brand. Before I was at Pinterest, I worked at Facebook. I was an early content strategist there, and I co-created their first style guide. Before that, I co-led a design agency with my husband, Matt, and we were eventually hired by Facebook. I am the first person in my family to graduate from college, and I went on to study philosophy at a #1 ranked divinity school, the University of Chicago. So that's me. Now, if I were to walk off the stage right now after telling you that, you could have formed a couple different stories. You might, if you're a really generous kind of a person, think, oh, Tiffany's really nice, and she seems like she works hard. But if you were a more skeptical kind of a person, or if you're like me, you might think, Tiffany is completely obnoxious, and I never want to have a beer with her, ever. But the fact of the matter is, you would have formed a story. Now, imagine instead that I started this story by telling you this. This is me. I'm Tiffany number 2. Hi, I'm Tiffany. I grew up in Texas and Tennessee and Indiana. We didn't have a lot of money growing up, but we had a lot of fun, like once we lived in this bunkhouse by a horse stable. We moved like 10 times between the time I was in kindergarten and my senior year. And I wasn't really sure if I wanted to go to college, and in fact, I didn't really apply on time, so my boyfriend in high school, his mom made me, and she told me to come over to her house, and she had all my applications on the table, so I'd fill them out. In school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I changed my major like 4 times, and then after I graduated, I really still didn't know what I was going to do, so I took a year off to pay down some of my debt by working at a restaurant and cleaning these crazy people's houses. I decided to go to grad school because one of my professors recommended me to it, so I did. I went to grad school. But I realized when I got in that I really didn't want to get a PhD in philosophy, so I quit actually before getting my PhD. After I graduated, I was $65,000 in debt, and I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. So I applied to 40 jobs and got my very first job out of grad school, and that was a cold calling gig. And it was terrible, and my boss was crazy, so I quit after about 3 months before finally landing my first good job. And this job was writing blog posts for a small design agency who hired me actually with no relevant writing sample whatsoever. The way they hired me was I sent them a paper I had written on Marx and Nietzsche, comparing the two actually somehow, and they hired me. So that's me. So now imagine that I had told you this story instead of the other one. You would have formed a completely different understanding of me, and you would have a different impression of me when you came to see me later. Now, both of these stories are true, but both of them are incredibly incomplete. But no matter what, you would have made a story out of incomplete data. This is what the psychologists and economists like to call narrative coherence. Our almost uncanny ability to make a story out of any amount of data, no matter how much of it exists, no matter if there is really a story. In other words, what you see is all there is. What people see of us, in some ways, is all there is. You don't know what you don't know in certain cases. Now, if it's true that we are all storytellers, as designers and writers and people just talking to each other, then this might mean we have a unique opportunity to help people see more. Maybe to be a little more thoughtful about the data that we include, or the data that we don't include, or maybe just to be a little more subtle and nuanced about it. It's not very easy work, being subtle, and I'm not even very good at it, but it's something I think that good storytellers are good at. And it's something I think you need to remember on the way to reaching the summit of truth. So that's number one, remembering you're telling a story. So the second thing I want to talk about is telling your story. And for reasons which may be sort of implied by the previous things we talked about, this is not really easy for anybody. It's not easy for people, it's not easy for businesses. Typically we're really bad at it because we go around sort of borrowing other people's stories for ourselves. And some of that's kind of good. It's kind of what we talked about earlier with like a remix. But some of it is sort of this obfuscation where we're not like getting to the bottom of our story. And I know this firsthand. Like I said, Matt and we ran this little web design agency, and there's this moment, this like crucial moment in our company's history where we were like, are we an agency? Are we a studio? Are we a consultancy? Are we two freelancers? Like, are we even married anymore? It was just like, it was all about the fact that there were all these stories like somehow contained in each of these words, and we were just like flinging around, and we would read a book and we'd be like, oh, we're an agency, and then some studio would get a great client, we'd be like, no, we're a studio, and it was just this total mess. But the bottom line of it was that, we were kind of just borrowing all these other ideas and making them our own. I do this in my own work, just my personal creative work or whatever you want to call it, all the time. When I was prepping for this talk, for example, I had watched like every single other build talk and about 20 TED Talks, and also read like 10 books in the span of like 1 week. And so by the end of that week, I like tried to do a first draft of this talk, and it was the most terrible, just terrifying Franken-talk that you've ever seen. It was terrible. I had no idea what I was saying. I was so confused. The problem, of course, is that I was using other people's stories and not my own. So here's a couple things that I do sometimes when I start doing that. The first thing that I have to do, especially as a recovering academic, is to put the book down. Just like step away from the books. At some point, you got to stop the flow of data and just ask yourself, like, what the fuck am I trying to say? Now, more often than not, unfortunately, you will kind of draw a blank. You actually probably don't know what you're trying to say. Some of you probably do. A lot of the speakers here probably do. I usually don't. And so, but the good thing about putting down the book is it sort of turns down the volume on other people's voices. It gives you a little bit of narrative license. But once you start drawing blanks, there are kind of two options that you have. One is to ask somebody else what your story is. Hey, I don't know who I am, do you? And that can be good if you have like a really good friend, but a better option at this point, since you still have some time, is to sort of ask yourself. Now, if you ask yourself, what story am I telling? You're probably going to freak out because that is a huge existential kind of a question. But you can bring it down to earth a little maybe by just asking, actually, what do I know? So usually what this culminates in is this kind of like known list for me. When I'm writing a talk, for example, I'll get all wound up and then I'll eventually just write out like, actually, what are the like 5 things I really actually know about this? Or things that are brown. When I was running our business, sometimes when we were trying to figure out what we were, I would say, actually, what do we really like doing? What are we actually good at? Just to sort of like get yourself to the basics, to get some of the noise out from around your head. And once you've done that, it's a little easier to find the ground. And the way I look at the ground are sort of these moments where you kind of know the things that you know, and then you go through and you can kind of like put stars by the things that actually interest you. And I find that in the intersection between the thing that I know and the thing that I know that actually seems interesting to me usually contains the seeds of a pretty decent idea. No guarantees that will be executed perfectly, but it's at least got the seeds of a story in it. I kind of accidentally used this process, if you want to call it that, a while back when I was writing an article for Andy's publication, The Manual. And when I started out, I sort of had this like lofty sense that I needed to write something good. And it needed to be good. And so everybody around me at the time was talking about agile things. And so immediately I'm like, I'm going to write an article about agile content strategy. And I wrote like 3 horrible essays called Content Strategy for Spaceships and like Rocket Content, just like really bad things that you don't ever want to read. And what I realized after a while is just that this wasn't a story I was interested in telling at all. I mean, I sort of do agile content strategy, but I don't really know what it is. I don't really know how I do it. And I'm really not interested in it. So eventually I just had to like give all that up. And kind of go back and like, well, what do I actually know? And I realized that the thing that I was interested in was the word agile. And the reason I was interested in that was because it was about a way of working. And I did all the math on it, and eventually I came out with an article that was kind of about just practicing passion in your work. Totally unrelated, but at least it sort of had those seeds together. Now, you can kind of tell when like a company is good at doing this. When a company sort of knows what they know and then sort of balances it against what they're interested in or what they want to do or what their vision is. Of course, the obvious version of this is Apple. They have a very good brand. They tell a pretty coherent story with it. But of course, there are less obvious choices too. I recently stumbled upon these books by this guy who ran Zingerman's Deli. It's this tiny little deli started by 2 guys who basically, or used to be tiny. It was like 2 guys in a kitchen. They made bagels. And then later, it grew into this like $50 million a year business. And one of the things that's striking about it is that it has kind of like maintained its Ann Arbor, Michigan personality through its growth. And you can really see that in all of the different stories that it tells as a business. And one of these stories is in these like business books I recently picked up by the founder, Zingerman himself. And I don't read a ton of business books, but because usually I will read one and then I just freak out and put it down. But these are sort of good. And they're good because I think of the way they tell Zingerman's story. And I'm just going to give you 2 reasons why. One of the reasons why is that the title is A Lapsed Anarchist's Approach to Being a Better Leader. So like Zingerman was this anarchist guy when he was in college, and he's like really interested in that still. And so the entire book is like littered with these quotes from these anarchists from the 70s. But it like feels like his voice, like the way it's written. He didn't choose to omit that. It was something he was actually interested in, and he went ahead and included it. And the other piece of it is that he writes what he actually knows. So he's been running this deli for, I don't know, I can't remember how many years, 30 years or something. And the one thing that he knows really well is that the energy that people feel when they come into his deli matters a lot. So he spends a lot of his time on these woo-woo concepts like creating a good vibe and keeping your employees' energy up, which is awesome, something we should all do. But he actually even recommends like, hey, you know what? You should go out to 10 different delis or 10 different businesses you see and just check how you feel when you walk in them. And like, go write that down, go write those adjectives down. And then go back to your own business and do that to your business. And so it kind of goes along this way. And basically you just get this sense that he's sort of in control of what he knows and also kind of okay with not scuffing out any of that data that actually makes his personality come through. And I think it's pretty good. So that's number 2, trying to find your story. Number 3. So those techniques that I just sort of shared, if you want to say are techniques, they can be really nice, but sometimes, of course, during the course of a creative process, they won't really be enough. They just won't be sufficient to just ask a couple questions and get on with it. Sometimes to get the bottom of what it is you're trying to say, you're going to have to take a little bit of a deeper journey, and that journey is probably going to be something rather internal. Or as the poet Rumi puts it, what you are looking for can only be found inside of you. Another way of putting it is that these creative processes where you're really trying to tell a story often feel somewhat like a hero's journey. And this is my drawing of the hero's journey. It's very accurate. But yeah, you can kind of see that at the top you have this hero, and there's the known world and the unknown world. And the hero goes like out of the known world into the unknown world, and then suddenly faces monsters and challenges and gets deeper into the unknown, and then finally like hits smack dab into the abyss, almost dies. If she's a true hero, then she doesn't die. And so she kind of goes out of it, and then there's this like awkward moment where she's forced to confront herself. And then there's atonement and things are set right. And I left out all the supernatural aids and all that, but it's a really it's a really harrowing process. And if you decide to take such and such a journey, it is likely that what you find on the inside will scare you a little bit. And I'm just going to tell you kind of like what I recently found on my own sort of hero's journey. One of the things you might find that scares you is that you start to hear voices. And these voices may have like completely conflicting opinions about what it is that you're trying to do and what the truth is. And they may just not agree at all, and they may not like each other. Or at least that's sort of what I hear. And since we're all here together and it seems appropriate, I'm just going to introduce you to the voices in my head and kind of how they related to this talk. And I just gave them these names. I'm sure they probably would want to go by other names. But the first one is, we'll just call her Elle. And during this talk, she was like, you know, I don't really like writing talks, and I'm not really into conferences that much. And she kind of just went and started tapping everybody else on the shoulder, asking them, like, maybe wouldn't they just rather come have a glass of wine or take a walk on the beach or something. And then there's Punk, who's kind of like the creative backbone of the operation, always is like, I'm not doing that, I'm too busy for that, but then eventually comes in and saves everything by writing it all. Kind of moody, doesn't show up to meetings on time. And then there's a professor, kind of a slow, objective type of a thinker, really relishes the opportunity to practice her rhetoric, but moves way too slowly and doesn't really have an opinion. And then, of course, there's CEO, who's just sort of managing everything, just managing the shit out of everybody, and just really micromanaging them, telling them all how they should be and how they should act and really what they should wear. And she's the one who comes up with all these ideas to do talks in the first place. And usually these voices, they sort of have an agreement, like, you stay off my lawn, I'll stay off yours, and all is well. But on creative projects, they're almost always forced into some sort of collaboration. And this almost always ends in a kind of a fight. It gets hairy fast, like Punk stops showing up to meetings, and CEO starts calling meetings at 9 a.m. to be passive-aggressive, and Professor starts like looking over everybody's shoulder, going like, that doesn't make any sense. And before you know it, the whole thing falls apart. Punk slams the door. She's like, screw you guys, I'm out of here. And then the rest of them just sort of sit there staring at their computer screens for 2 days. So basically, the only way that I found to manage these voices is to sort of like get to know them a little bit. and to be kind of nice to them. Sometimes they maybe need to have a little meeting with each other where they all get to say what they'd like to have happen. And that's usually a pretty helpful way I found to come to some kind of a peace. And they do like a waterfall process usually. It's just like one after the other, they each come in, they have their job, and then they're out, and it's all good. And I encourage you to do the same, maybe. Just kind of get to know your brains a little bit. And you may not have the same voices or any voices at all. Anyway, so once you've sort of turned the enemies, who are your voices, into your friends, you can start to focus a little bit more on your actual enemy. And you'll find in the hero's journey that your real enemy is perfection. And I am intimately familiar with perfectionism. I displayed it at an early age. And like I said earlier, I grew up in Tennessee, so of course I started cheerleading when I was in like 3rd grade. And we were always being sent off to these cheerleading camps, and we would be forced to practice things like our high Vs, which is just like standing there with your arms in a V. And when you're doing high V, it's really important not to have spaghetti arms. Like you can't let your arms flop. But I was really intense about this, and when I was doing that, I remember just like pretty much just like titanium alloying my arms, just suturing them. They like would not move. And I remember actually the time when I knew it was a problem was when this guy who was this cheerleading coach, who is a college student, was like, said in a Southern accent, he's like, y'all gonna need to move that a little bit. And just always things like that, you know, like some humiliating moment with some college-age cheerleading guy. But But you know, I did have some angels on my side with perfectionism. This is my Poppy, he's my grandpa. And I lived with him and my grandma sometimes growing up on their farm. And like, I have this vision of him just basically always popping up from behind bushes when I was like mowing the lawn or weed eating. And he would always say this one thing, which I have no idea where he got it from because it doesn't sound like him. But you have to imagine it in a kind of Indiana farmer's mumble, if you can imagine that. And he would say, perfection is not necessary nor required. Approximations are good enough for all practical purposes. And he would like literally follow me around and say that. He said it to me when I was little so many times that I like had it memorized by the time I was in kindergarten. But okay, so in case you don't have a Poppy or a humiliating cheerleading moment, this is another sort of angel that might help you in fighting perfectionism. This is one of my very favorite books. It's called Bird by Bird, and it's a book of writing advice I think you guys heard about earlier. And it's by Anne Lamott. Even though it's for writers, I think it's for everybody who tries to do anything hard, basically. But she has one little exercise in this book that I've used a lot and that actually really helps me. And it's basically just writing a letter. So if you're sitting there in front of a computer screen and you're totally stuck, you have no idea what's going to go on, just try to like back off, stop trying to tell a story, and try to write a letter to like somebody you're close to, somebody young like your nephew or your kid if you happen to have one running around. And this is a good way to sort of strike the formality from things. I've actually used this a lot of times in weird situations. So like recently I was trying to write an error message that was really hard to write. It was like connection error. And it was really weird and hard to write. So I just wrote it as a letter to my grandma. She's not young, but it really helped actually. I've used it on clients before, like when I used to have our design agency, I would say, they would try to tell me like what their business was about, and I'd be like, I have no idea what you're saying, but could you just write me a letter like I'm 5? And it would often really work. Just the basic idea behind it just being that like, you need to like loosen yourself up a little and do whatever it is that it takes. I don't know if it's like a bath or a drink or writing a letter or what. Now, the other thing I want you to remember when you're like deep in it is that there will probably be like a day or two when you're like on your real hero's journey to finding the truth where you really just want to die or you want to kill somebody or both. These are the days when like your plan, your world has gone black and all your plans have come to nothing. And I'm going to be mad at myself later for including this slide, but this was me like during my sort of abyss moment when I was writing this talk. I had basically taken every single book off my shelf, pasted all of these psycho notes all over the wall in my house. I'd sent my husband Matt out camping like on his own for 2 days. I was day drinking. I was basically like, it was terrible. I was like Michael Douglas in Wonder Boys, like with his pink robe on, just like cigarettes. It was just completely terrible. And I really wanted to quit and die. But I didn't. I didn't quit and die. I managed to pull through. And one of the reasons that I managed to pull through is because I was able to remember point number 4 in this whole saga of finding the truth. And that is that sometimes it's going to be really important for you to call on your muses, or your lifeline, or whatever you want to call them. But I bet I probably have like 10 different muses, but there are really 3 core ones. So I thought I would just introduce them for you as an example. They're basically like a collaboration muse, and an inspiration muse, and a soul muse. And this is collaboration muse. This is my husband, Matt. And he pretty much has like, he looks like collaboration oracle or something in that. It's like kind of crazy picture to choose. But he basically is the one who has he has opposite skills as me. He happens to be my husband, that's lucky. But it doesn't have to be your partner. Basically, a good collaboration muse is somebody who, if you're really detail-oriented and perfectionistic, teaming up with somebody who's sort of big picture thinking and maybe I don't know, just a little more relaxed and can tell stories with a little less torture is a good place to start. So collaboration muses are really good to have. The other type of muse that I call upon is the inspiration muse. And I know I told you guys not to read books earlier, but I usually find that dead writers and living writers are both actually really, really good muses. They help me with that thing people call lateral thinking. So even if I'm stuck on something that seems like a business problem, if I read a good book, or if I talk to somebody who's taught me something about writing before, it usually just kind of bursts me out of it a little bit. And in fact, I kind of got my idea for this talk from a writing teacher who I called up recently when I was trying to do something. And I said, you told us in that personal essay class, you told us there was one main thing we needed to remember when we were writing personal essays. And could you just remind me what that was? And he paused for a minute, and then he was like, be weirdly honest. And I thought about it for a second. I was like, maybe I could just do a whole talk where I was just weirdly honest the whole time. But his whole point with being weirdly honest is that it's actually this really nice device for getting you past saying things that are apparently obvious and getting you into a place where you're saying things that are not quite as apparently obvious, kind of telling more subtle stories. And who knows if you'll do it, but it's good advice. And the final, and probably the most important muse I have, who is my soul muse, I would call it, is my nanny. And she is my grandma. And I'm going to show you a clip of her talking in a second, but I think it needs some explanation. So Nanny is in her 60s. She's a chain smoker. She is from Jamestown, Tennessee in Appalachia. She is one of those literal coal miners' daughters, like Loretta Lynn. They only had one pair of shoes, and they tell a lot of stories about it. And there's steel guitars in church, and the preachers have snakes, and that sort of thing. And that's not a real glass of wine. By the way, she would never drink a real glass of wine, but she is hiding a real cigarette behind her back, which is really funny. But anyway, Nanny is a fantastic storyteller, and she's somebody who just is really, really influential in my life. And probably she's the reason why I am interested in storytelling at all, and why I want to write. And so I imagine each of us has somebody like that who just really affected them in some important way. And I'd say that my nanny is probably that person for me. Anyway, like I said, she tells good stories. So I want to just show you a clip real quick. And this is Nanny one Christmas. Matt and I, we went to my grandparents' farmhouse, and we filmed Nanny. We just put her on camera. We said, hey, would you just tell us some stories? And we were thinking oh, yeah, she'll tell us a few stories. She went on for, I think it was 3 hours straight, did not stop, just chain smoked all the way through it. And it was great. But I thought I would show you just a little clip of one of these stories.
Well, we had these guys down there visiting my grandmother from Ohio. And one of them name was Charles Chenal, and the other one's name was Johnny Slaybaugh. And at Halloween time, we'd get out and turn over people's toilets and put logs across the road. We was ornery. And so we had turned over my sister's toilet. And they had come down through a field where her toilet sat to come down to Daddy's.
And he drove you crazy, didn't he?
Well, there's down Daddy's nearly every night. And I didn't like them. So we turned over Wilma's toilet, knowing they was going to come down that path. Well, I don't know how Johnny got around it. He's the one I really wanted to step in the poop hole. But he didn't. Charles did. He fell in. The toilet hole. And Johnny come on down Daddy's. And I said, "Where's Charles at?" He said, "Somebody turned over Wilma's toilet." He fell in it. And I rolled on the floor laughing. He said he had to go down back and down at Ma's and get cleaned up. He fell all the way in that toilet hole.
What did you call him after that?
We called him Charles Shitchenall from now.
Anyway, yeah, no, I think that was like her first, that was like just her little warm-up that she was telling about this, about Charles Shitchagall. But anyway, that's Nanny, and I thought I would end on that because, I don't know, it's not necessarily the story I'm trying to tell, but she is a real inspiration, I think, for me, for trying to tell stories. And she does a pretty good job of telling her truth while also being sort of entertaining about it. And I think that's great. So I just kind of want to recap what we've talked about a little bit. So we've kind of talked about reaching the summit of truth, and the ways that I've basically talked about doing that are by kind of remembering the fact that no matter what you're doing, you're telling a story. Also by remembering to try to tell your own story and not let other people's voices get in your way. By looking inward when you're not able to get to the answer in that way. And then also by kind of finding your muses. But what I think this all boils down to is that finding a story at all is not so much about finding it as it is about following it. And I imagine this will look differently for different people. Like, some of you probably don't even care about the truth with a capital T. You might have some other thing that makes you think something is a good story. And I think that's an interesting thing to pursue. And I think sometimes when writers are talking about this, they literally call it following the story. They say things like, you know, sometimes whatever that story is, whatever the thing you're trying to say is, it will sort of like waft into your window, and it'll be this like really strong breeze. And you'll know exactly what it is. But other times it'll be really, really faint, and you'll feel like maybe it's never going to come back. And you'll kind of feel sort of lost and alone and all those things. But the job of a writer, at least, and of most storytellers, is to sort of just listen and wait for the fog to come back in, and to keep sort of pursuing it regardless of all of that uncertainty. So I guess I encourage us all to just follow the story, and specifically to follow your story. That's it. Thank you.